Just to let you know that the session will be recorded today. My name is Janet Carton, and I would very warmly like to welcome you this afternoon to the launch of the IUA Collaborative Webinar Series, which is a unique initiative by 8 Irish universities who are each contributing topical webinars on issues important for research supervision across 2022. And the programme of activities is available on the Eventbrite link, which will appear shortly in the chat room. And also, if anybody has any questions about the programme, please contact me directly. That would be great. I'd like to thank the National Forum who have supported this webinar today. We're very lucky today to have Professor Bob Harris from Karolinksa Institutet, who will talk about successfully supervising research students remotely, something that has become increasingly important over the last year and a half, and no doubt going forward. And last but not least, as we are also launching UCD's Research Supervisor Support and Development Programme for 2022 today, we're taking the opportunity to award 2 very worthy recipients of the Dean of Graduate Studies Award for Excellence in Doctoral Supervision. And that's Professor Eilish McAuliffe and Associate Professor Benjamin Cowan from UCD. And after this presentation, Bob's webinar will begin. So I've no more to say at this point in time. I just would like to introduce our Dean of Graduate Studies and Deputy Registrar, Professor Barbara Dooley, who will officiate the prize giving and will also welcome Professor Bob Harris. Thanks a million. Over to you, Barbara.
Thanks, Janet, and certainly many thanks to you for not only having the seminar here today with Bob, which I'm looking forward to hearing from Bob shortly, but also for working with our colleagues right across Ireland and all the universities to collaborate together on the really important topic area of supervision for doctoral students and research students. So many thanks to you for really spearheading this initiative. Okay, so the main activity for us today is to hear from Bob. So without that, I'm going to move to the other important activity, which is to award our second annual Dean's Award for Excellence in Doctoral Supervision. And we have 2 recipients this year. We had one last year in our first, and the first awardee is Professor Eilish McAuliffe from the School of Nursing, Midwifery and Health Systems. Congratulations, Eilish. And you can see a certificate, and there is also a paperweight acknowledging that. Both of these will be sent on to Eilish after the event in acknowledgement of her excellence in supervision. I'm just going to share 1 or 2 small things with you, just to give you a flavour of what we observed. So the award itself is we have a team both of internal members of UCD and external to UCD who review all of the submissions and then make our awards on the basis of what we have. And we have criteria which we look at in terms of the excellence that we hope to see in those submissions. So in terms of Professor McAuliffe's submission, what we observed as a panel of judges was that the students' nomination, and particularly their supervisory statement, demonstrated excellence not only in supervision, but also leadership in your approach to your research supervisory practice. So that leadership piece came through very, very strongly. And just very briefly, a comment or 2 from the students' submission. So that Eilish is an inspiration, approachable and supportive supervisor to all of her students, always available to advise on who best to contact and how best to approach any issue that arose during my research, especially when it came to creating and building professional relationships within the case study hospital where my research took place. So that sense of creating a community and allowing the researcher to connect. And also provided expert advice on how to respond to reviewers and to improve our articles based on their advice. So that sense of preparing students in writing, not just being supportive, but also in the really important area of writing. So congratulations, Professor McAuliffe. And we might just give a round of applause for Professor McAuliffe at this particular point. I know we can't hear one another, but in any event. And then our second recipient is Associate Professor Benjamin Cowan in the School of Information Communication Systems. Congratulations, congratulations, Ben. And in relation to Ben's, what the panel recognized in this submission was that, again, the excellence in terms of the supervisory practice, but also demonstrated innovation and excellence in the approach. So I thought that it was the innovative piece that came really strongly through in the submission from Professor Cowan. And just a comment from students: fostering an inclusive and amicable lab environment that promotes many collaborative research projects, so that collaborative piece, and also organizes monthly seminar series with prominent researchers in the field of human-computer interaction, allowing current doctoral students to grow the professional networks across academia and industry. And Professor Cowan's consistent feedback teaches these students to write with their audience in mind, growing each student's mastery of their topic and ownership of their thesis. And I love that piece of ownership of their thesis, and which is really important that students do understand it as their thesis. So we're going to maybe have maybe a comment very briefly from. Thank you, Joanna. Nothing better than the virtual clap. So I'm going to go to our winners, and just maybe they might reflect a moment on.
No, I just the thing is, at the moment, there isn't much around. We want a quick sale. We want like no hassle. We don't want them competing with people, kind of like
feedback.
If they want to
turn off all the speakers, please. Yeah,
Joanna, yeah.
The joys of the virtual world. Anyway,
I know, Zoom, isn't it great?
Never mind. Okay, so just we forget we had that feedback loop. Okay, and we'll maybe ask you to think about what does this award mean for you.
So I'll go first. So I mean, for me, it means the world, really. I mean, it's an absolute honor to receive it, as well, because it's nominated by the students. So not only does it give you a sense that you're doing an okay job, I suppose, but it also kind of gives you an idea that there's a real appreciation within the team that you're putting together, because really that's how I see doctoral supervision. Is it's a team effort. And it's something that these people are future researchers in the future of science, and so it's a real honor to be supervising them, and to be involved in their growth and being able to give them that kind of team learning experience is something that I'm really passionate about, and that's something that we really try and instill in our lab in ICS. Thanks,
Ben. Eilish?
Yes, I'm delighted to receive this award, and I'd like to thank the two students, Lisa and Roisin, who nominated me, but also thanks to all of my PhD students for the journey they've taken me on, particularly I think over the last couple of years with COVID, which has been a very difficult time. I would certainly echo what Ben is saying, and I suppose for me, supervision is about getting that balance right between supporting and challenging the students. And I think, this is recognition that somehow I have got that balance right, because I often feel myself that I'm maybe overcritical of students, but to get that support and balance in the relationship, I think is critically important. I'd also like to thank somebody else who's not mentioned today, is my partner in crime, Dr. Aoife de Bruin, who has been a co-supervisor with me for many of my students that are finishing this year. We had, in total 5 students completing this past calendar year. But Aoife came to me as a postdoc many years ago, and although she wasn't qualified to supervise at that point, I know she spent a lot of time behind the scenes supporting our PhD students. And then she was our first Ad Astra fellow in the school, and was able to take on supervision duties, and came on board with me as a supervisor for several of my students. And I think it's been a really good collaboration between the two of us. And I refer to that support and challenge, because I think Aoife is a bit more forthcoming with the praise than I am, and often I can be quite critical, but I think the students obviously need both. So you know, I think that combination really helps students in their journey towards successfully completing their PhD. And we've had quite a number of successes with a lot of students completing PhD by publication and producing a huge volume of work, particularly in this difficult couple of years that we've had with COVID. So I'd like to thank all of my students.
Thanks, Eilish, for that. And I think you make a very good, I've too had the pleasure of working with a postdoc who's gone on to a faculty position and working like that in terms of that supporting and challenging, and it can be a very rewarding and to be able to mentor young early career faculty is another privilege, not just the privilege of supervision, but the privilege of mentoring early career as well. So I completely hear what you're saying. It genuinely is a privilege. But can I ask you about innovation? Because I said, when we read your submission, one of the things that came through was some kind of more innovative ways of supervision and thinking about your supervisory practice quite innovatively. So how do you go about doing things like that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think for me, it boils down to relationships, actually. And so it boils down to having that kind of trust relationship there. And so, and also giving students as many opportunities to be able to interact and chat and discover and kind of be challenged by ideas. So whether that's running seminars and inviting leading people to come in, and also, you know, not just inviting them to come in and then leave, but to kind of discuss and have meetings with the students, discuss their ideas and give them an opportunity to present their work. But also, like, you know, we have a thing in our lab where, well, before COVID, we still do that now in terms virtually, but we have a kind of a, you know, almost every second or third day, we have a tea session where everybody comes together, has a cup of tea or coffee, talks about their issues and ideas, whether that's like issues they're facing in life, especially during COVID, but also about research issues. And there's so many ideas and so many times where we've discussed issues in PhD research that really kind of help students. And so for me, it's kind of fostering that relationship that you have with students in as many ways as possible, and showing them that you're there for them, really, when, you know, when they're facing struggles and challenges. Let's be honest, doing a PhD can be quite a struggle sometimes. So you know, I think it's knowing that there's somebody in your corner to be able to do that, and however many things you can do, contact points you can get, getting them to be involved in the community that you're involved in, getting them to involved in activities and that expands their networks, but also kind of making the whole thing feel approachable, I think is a really important thing. Not just that 1 hour meeting every week, but having a lot of different other ways of engaging.
And you make a really good point about community. So research cultures, you know, is a really important thing. And when we looked at the data from the postgraduate student survey results for the postgraduate students recently, I was working with Joanna Niemer in graduate studies. And one of the things that we looked at was that thing of community and seminar. And in some areas of the university, that community and research culture is not as strong as in others. So you're speaking to a kind of a really important piece that when we look at the whole feedback of the student journey, that's important to consider. And I think you speak very nicely to culture there. So that's, I think, an important piece of being part of a bigger community and a culture of research, and not just the activity which a supervisor of engaging in the PhD. So it's a very nice example of that. I'm going to ask Eilish, what would be your top tips for successful supervision, or are there top tips for successful supervision? What would you think are kind of key ingredients then for successful supervision?
I mean, I think the support and challenge balance that I mentioned earlier is a critical thing. You just have to get that right. And I suppose what I found is that's different for every student. So there isn't a recipe that you can follow. Every student is different. And I think getting to know the student in the early stage of the PhD is really important. One of the things I would say is that the most successful PhD students are ones that have worked with me first as a research assistant. So that I've had the opportunity to get to know them and encourage them towards the PhD. Not to say that, you know, PhDs that come in without that background aren't successful, but I do think that, you know, affords an opportunity for the supervisor to see what the students' strengths are and to support them through the PhD. The other thing that I think is really important is supporting students to develop an independence, because there is that kind of close relationship between the student and the supervisor. And one of the things I try to do is, on the research studies panel, encourage the student to have an external member from another university in another part of the world, so that they can start to build a research network that is independent of the supervisor, usually somebody that I have had no contact with previously or have no relationship with, so that that's a relationship between the student and an expert in their field that is separate from the relationship with the supervisor. I think they're critical things. I'm also a huge fan of PhD by publication, because I think it gives the student some positive feedback early on in PhD. If they're publishing throughout, they don't have that same dread and fear as they come towards the end of the PhD. So I think it's really, you know, a very positive way of getting them over that imposter syndrome that they all talk about, and helping them to move on and see the PhD as, you know, a journey and not a kind of huge obstacle that they somehow need to overcome.
Thanks, Eilish. And Ben, would you like to add anything about what you think are tips or ingredients or whatever of what you see as things that are important in the supervisory practice?
Yeah, I definitely echo everything that Eilish has just been saying about the quality of the qualities that are needed in supervision. I think having someone external in the RSP is always useful. We do that as well. So having somebody that, you know, is an expert in the area. So again, the same reason, it kind of expands the network for the student. It also expands them to different ideas, so different approaches that could that their research could be could go down. I mean, one of the fundamental things for me is that whenever doing PhD supervision, I kind of try and stress that I am researching with the student. So it's not that there's a hierarchical structure there. It's more about the fact that we're a team together trying to understand a question. And, you know, that involves all of the idiosyncrasies, problems, challenges they're involved in that. And I think that works by creating that relationship that isn't seen as so hierarchical. It makes students more open. It also makes them more likely to challenge you as an academic, and look, that keeps it all interesting for us, and is able to do those things. And you know, the other thing is as well for me is just to I'm really passionate about work-life balance, I suppose, as well. That's the other thing for me. Because a successful supervision means that you need to care about that. You need to care about your students have time outside the lab that they can do things, as well as time inside the lab. And that makes their work much better, in my view. So, you know, I encourage, you know, no working at weekends, no working at evenings, that's all possible. And so we try and really move that forward, and you know, really stress that work-life balance. And I think that's really important to realize, especially in these kind of stressful times. But that to me is a really important thing.
Thanks very much for that. And I think work-life balance is really critical, because I know when we were developing the handbook a number of years ago, we were very keen to put in kind of typical hours of work. And I know nothing is perfect. It isn't always, you know, within, and it does need to flex. But just an acknowledgement that this is not a 24/7, 7 days a week activity that we hear so much about, that can become quite toxic. That there is a sense that there should be a balance outside. And I think that's a really important message. I'm quite conscious of our time and to moving on to Bob. So I'm going to thank you both. And we may call on you to maybe contribute to the supervisor development program on you know, to demonstrate the excellence you've shown and actually bring it to life for others. So congratulations again, and I'm delighted you're able to join us, because I know, you know, everybody has kind of commitments and pulled and dragged, and you know, because we're on Zoom, people think you've got every single hour that can just be slotted in one after the other without a break. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm going to now move us to, otherwise John will make sure you're not on time, Barbara, keep time. So I'm going to do as I'm supposed to. I'm going to move us on to the main, our main topic today, which is our seminar from Professor Bob Harris, who's in the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. His CV is extensive and long. He's currently a professor. He's a supervisor. He's active PI. He contributes to the program in UCD previously. He's a current president of Orpheus, which is the Organization for PhD Education in Biomedicine and Health Sciences in European Systems. And he's a well-recognized expert in the area of PhD supervision. And rather than take any longer in introducing Bob from the time that he has with us, I'm going to hand over to Bob, who's going to talk us through successfully supervising research students remotely. So welcome, Bob. Welcome virtually back to Dublin.
Thanks very much. Of course, it would have been more fun to be with you, but this is a wonderful opportunity anyway. You asked me just before we started when it gets dark. It's dark now, actually, dark and snowy. I'd like to start by saying congratulations to Eilish and Ben. It sounds like you're not going to need me in the future if you got such good supervisors already in-house. So what I'm going to do is just take this opportunity to have a Friday afternoon chat with you. And this isn't rocket science, but maybe I'll try and inspire you to think about things that you might not have thought about before. I'm sure a lot of this will actually be things that you recognize, but maybe I'll articulate it in a way that you might not have thought about. And Janet will be able to send you a PDF of the slides should there be anything there that catches your attention. So let's start by saying, okay, we're in the pandemic. I mean, and I think that if you're the same as me, then most of the time when you start talking about the pandemic, then you start talking about the negative effects, right? And it automatically becomes a negative experience. But just look at this. I'm not sure within your 8 universities you have this extensive interaction before, but now you're able to do it with over, what are we, 111 people online. So it's fantastic. And think about the possibilities, and especially for me, not to have to contribute to carbon footprint by being able to just zoom in from my computer here. So yeah, we're going to talk about this. So I'm the head of doctoral education at KI. We have over 2,300 PhD students. So it's a lot of supervisors in there, and I've been involved in supervisor development for many years. But now we're going to be talking about how to do successful supervision from remotely, which is a nice subject considering that we're still in the throes of the pandemic. So there we go. That's me. So I put a question mark with the successfully, because you're not sure you're successful until you've actually done it, right? So these will maybe be tips or things to think about supervising students remotely. And when I think about this, then this is the image I like to think about. This will be remote for me on a remote beach somewhere with my mobile phone in hand and talking to my students. Of course, that's not the reality at the moment. And I'm sat in my daughter's room surrounded by my ponies and pink things all over the place, because it's the only room in the house where I can be undisturbed when I'm doing this type of teaching. So it's not necessarily that. But what I want to do is to zoom in on 3 different aspects. One is how you can organize this. One, how you can ensure that the educational development is still occurring. And most importantly, what you should think about from the personal side. And that's both from the personal side of your student and yourself as the supervisor. So hopefully I'm going to leave you lots of time at the end where hopefully we can trade stories. You can ask questions if you got them, and I think it would be more important to have that discussion. And I'm just going to give you some pointers and some things maybe that we could discuss. But let's get down to the basics first. And I think this the most important take-home message is at the top here. Supervision is not altered just because you're doing it remotely. It's exactly the same. You have exactly the same responsibilities to make sure that your student feels that they're developing. You might not be able to do everything in exactly the same way, but something you should be able to do. So this isn't sort of a cop-out, out of sight, out of mind, not applicable here at all. You're still a supervisor, and just because you're not necessarily at the workplace or your students aren't at the workplace, you can't see each other in action. Not that you necessarily do 24/7 anyway, but it doesn't mean that you're not a supervisor if you're not there in person. So your responsibilities are exactly the same, and really the expectations of the interactions of you and your student should be more or less the same. And if you think differently from that, then I would provoke you by saying, then you're not thinking right, because nothing changes. You still have the responsibility then of making sure that something's happening if your PhD student is able to do something. You need to be able to give them feedback about their tasks and to be able to have scientific discussions with them and to give them feedback about the level of their learning, especially when we're now talking about, we're soon, by next March, we're into 2 years. 2 years in the pandemic. That was as long as the Spanish flu pandemic was over 100 years ago. Do you provide a suitable work environment? I just told you, at the moment I'm sitting in my daughter's room. If I work from home, which I've actually chosen not to do so much in the last 1.5 years, I can walk to work. So I've actually been one of 3 people on a floor at the administration building where there's usually like 50 people a day, and we've been 3 people almost every day for the last 1.5 years. Otherwise, if I work at home, I'm sitting on the sofa with often if everyone else is away, with the computer on my lap, often with the TV in the background. Is that like the right type of work environment? Is that the type of environment that your students be working in as well? We need to be aware of psychosocial issues. It's different when you're then stuck at home and not interacting necessarily in a way. So that's like still your responsibility. And how will you do that? How will you check out? It's very easy to, if you're meeting somebody, if your students coming into your office, if you're working side by side with them at the bench in the lab, to assess how they're doing. But how do you really do that when you're staring into a computer screen? So that will be like a big focus of what I talk about. And of course, you still should be having discussions, and that becomes quite challenging. Will you be able to sit down and have this type of discussions? One of my favorite students, not that we should actually say we have favorite students, but they're historic, so then you can. He used to come in and we'd sit for hours, in my office discussing science. Can you do that when you're staring in a computer with each other? But it still means that you should be doing it, and we need to find creative ways then to try and achieve the same end in a different manner. But let's go through some of the things that we need to think about. Who are we talking about? Who's working remotely? If you have as hard restrictions as we in Sweden, we haven't had hard restrictions. It's just been you're encouraged to work from home, but it's not necessarily pain of death if you don't. And often it's been supervisors have been at home and students that have chosen to actually work from home. And if they're working from home, then there shouldn't be any problem because they're doing something of consequence to their PhD project and their education. But otherwise, if you've had students that need to travel, internationally in order to do field work or such, then it's not been possible. If you have clinical students that require patient contact, that's probably been reduced or completely stopped as well. So for some of us, it's been impossible to work remotely, but otherwise we need to define, are we talking about you as a supervisor at distance, or you're talking about your student at distance, or both of you? And slightly different angles depending on if it's you, them, or both. The second point is that everything I say is going to be very general, and of course it's specific for you and your student. Only you and your student know how to best interact, and no 2 pairs will do it in exactly the same way. So there'll be a plethora of different possibilities, and you need to find what works for you. And as I said at the start, I'm here to inspire you rather than to tell you what to do. One thing that I think is quite important to think about, as I already mentioned, and we tend to often start the pandemic discussion by saying, but if you flip the coin, we actually, we talk about the challenges of doing all this thing, but we should also think about the opportunities. This is a great way of actually redefining a lot of the work that we do. Is it possible that we will continue some form of remote supervision? Even post-pandemic, because we realize that this is actually an efficient way of working. So balance I usually flip the coin. There's 2 sides of the coin. So see both sides of the coin and see what we've actually learned already and how we can actually use that potentially in the future, because it's actually a smart way to do things. So I'm going to go through the organizational things first, and there are lots of aspects here as I try to illustrate on this cartoons, which I just ripped from the net, and that's really the way that you organize your digital meetings. So we're going to be focusing on digital interaction, whether you actually need them at all. I think that Zoom tiredness is a modern affliction, which is a chronic affliction for many of us that don't really achieve that life work balance that Barbara was alluding to. So let's start, and let's start from the beginning. How are you going to recruit students? It can't. Maybe you've been the same with us. We've not been recruiting so many, at least not internationally, because they've not been able to actually come to Sweden from wherever they come from in the world. And we need to think about, well, have you actually worked out how to do a good digital recruitment? The process, receiving the CVs and looking through them and trying to select your candidates is the same, but doing an interview via Zoom or digitally is as we're going to come and discussing a little while, it's quite, you don't get exactly the same information. So how are you going to make sure that you actually recruit people in the best way? Zoom proficiency. This is one of the things I love the most. How often do you have meetings when someone does this, right? They stop sharing their screen, because some people are not smart enough to only have one window open so that they can always come straight back to where they want to be, and to be able to shut it again. And especially when you're teaching, because for maybe those of you who are watching me now, you see me as you see my presentation and then you see a photo of me. But when I'm looking at the screen, all I see is my PowerPoint, and that's not interactive for me. So more for the person actually talking as opposed to the person receiving, especially in the teaching aspect. It's a lot more fun to be able to zip in and out of your presentation and find a way back. And I'm sure a lot of you have the same experience as me of people who use two screens and then shut down one of the screens, because otherwise you'll never find your presentation. It's always on the other screen. And you spend 2 minutes saying, well, do you see my pictures? Oh my God, I don't know where it is. How many people still after 1.5 years are not aware of how to mute themselves and unmute themselves, as we've already seen. I was in a fantastic meeting with the heads of departments last week, on Tuesday, actually this week. And someone had their microphone turned on and was on the phone to somebody complaining about how boring this meeting was. And everyone, the whole highest leadership of KI was listening in, and everyone was trying desperately email. But he was on the telephone, so no one could get in touch with him. It's like, these are basics. And by now, sort of learning how to use the mute function, learning how to use breakout groups, learning how to do galleries. How many people hold the presentation up when you start discussing things? You know, if you want to have an interactive interaction, then get rid of your presentation, go to gallery view and see as many faces as possible. So Zoom proficiency is something I think that if you've not learned it, and not just Zoom proficiency, but all the digital media that you might need to use in your supervision. Now I'm under real pressure to get back to where I was. So the other thing is the body language. That I forgot to say when I was just there. Now you're just seeing this part of me, which isn't the most beautiful part. I'm not sure there's any beautiful part of me, but anyway, and you know that you communicate a lot with your body language. Okay, you get cues, you can see whether people have the way they move in their seat and so on. Now you just have to work out how to see this part of the body and get all the cues. It's a lot more intensive. You need to really, really study. And it's impossible when you've got lots of pictures on the screen, lots of people. But if you're in a one-to-one meeting with your student, then it should be possible. But you really need to then learn how to interpret their facial cues, at least, because you're not seeing the rest of it. You don't know at the moment what I'm doing with my hands, if I'm like fidgeting because I'm nervous or whatever, and so on. So that's like a skill set that you need to develop, and it's not so easy. And if you don't think about it and develop those skills. So that's all the things that we can say about actually the sort of how we do it. How do you actually conduct the meeting? Do you have rules for how you're going to have the discussions, what you're going to take up? The more structure that you can give an interaction that you have with your students, the better, and decide on how you're going to do it. How long will you have the meeting? You can't sit in meetings for a long period of time. It's extremely taxing to sit in front of a computer screen for a long time. So lots of short meetings as opposed to long ones would be something to do. But it's something that you can agree on before you do it. How is the workplace? It's not perfect. Not everyone has the luxury of living in a place where you can actually have a defined workplace with a proper desk, but at least something working hours. When you're working from home, it's so easy. The kitchen is there with lots of distractions. The TV is there, you know, and that's not what's usually the case when you're in the workplace. So how would you actually, do you define when the working hours should be? And how should you include your domestic activities, which is quite kind of cool to do. In between meetings, you can put on some washing or put the dishwasher on or whatever, but is that really helping you focus on what you'll be supposed to be doing? That's not something that you would have in a workplace situation. So how much of what you do in your home environment would you actually be able to duplicate what you do in the workplace? And I think a healthy discussion about this with your students, depending on what the possibilities are in the domestic domain, should be quite important to discuss. Rules of engagement I've already mentioned. I think that's really, really important. Length and frequency of the meetings. Should you have a daily check-in just to make sure? How otherwise you're going to make sure people are like feeling good if you check in once a week or once every 2 weeks or so? Is it overkill to check in every day? Will you really have something to say? This is the thing that will be personal between you and your students, and you need to work out what works just for you in the best way. And maybe if you've got several students, you'll have different ways of doing this with different students. The digital communication I've already mentioned is not just Zoom, but it's actually ways of working on documents together, using all sorts of media. You're able to use document sharing in a good way. So you're able to work on manuscripts, or able to pull ideas around. Open Zoom meetings. It's very easily actually in Zoom to have your personal room where you just activate it so you're already on. If you need to be doing hands-on supervision, especially laboratory-based things where they need your expertise because you're still able to do things at the bench, unlike me, that doesn't understand anything my students are doing anymore. But in order to be able to give those instructions and be able to help with problems that come up, what do I do if I got a leaky piece of equipment or so? Then having an open Zoom room where someone can just start talking to you, and then you'll be online and able to do them. This is a way of actually interacting in a live way, which is something to think about. And of course, you need to be very disciplined about that, because if you start talking to other people, you need to make sure that you're muting yourself and so on. Again, we come back to the proficiency, but all these different things, the way that you potentially need to do parts of your supervision, your students are actually doing their work, you need to work out how best to do it. And maybe there are new techniques or new ways or new document sharing, they're coming, all sorts of aids that you don't know about. And then it's your duty to learn those things in order to facilitate the best way of doing it. And this will be part of your own professional development then. Do you record your meetings? So you could either, you have the record version in Zoom if you want to use that, or do you have another way of actually recording what's done? It's a lot easier if you're passing someone in the corridor to remind yourself, oh, just have you done that, right? But it's not so easy if you then have to make a time to have a Zoom meeting in order to check in and do these things. So how will you actually record things? And this is where the combination of emails or shared documents and meeting notes will be important. Make big projects smaller. Many of the students will feel it's overwhelming to have to do all this by themselves. So can you manage parts of your projects together in smaller portions? So this would give them the idea that something's happening and there's some progress. And the last point there, I think, is quite important. And we already heard Ben mention that a little bit, which is sort of contact with each other, sharing your experiences, getting help from each other. And if you're having issues like how do you deal with this, or I'm not getting this to work, anyone got any tips? Your interaction, we often put the focus on supervision on how the student's feeling, but you need to put just as much focus on how you're feeling, because if you're not feeling good, then you're not going to be any good for your students, right? So how do you actually keep up to date with what's going on with your colleagues? You'll only do that by actively interacting with you. And while you might think it's not a social interaction, but it's part of your scientific interaction as well. It could be something that to think about if you're not doing it so much. It's very easy to be isolated when you're working from home, right? Just because you are. And then for some people, it's like, if you don't make the effort, then nothing's going to change. We move into the personal side. And I think this is the most critical one, actually. As I've already mentioned, there are lots of issues about not being. It depends on how you are as a person. Some people will need social stimulation or scientific stimulation or professional stimulation. You need to talk to people of the same age group as yourself. Some people need the necessity to actually feel like the boss by being in charge of a group of people, or if that's important from a hierarchical point of view. You're all individuals, you all know what you need, and there'll be lots of potential for. There's a cultural diversity here, which is rather interesting, and different people from different cultures might relate to this feelings of isolation in different ways. Certainly international students that are then long way away from their families, and there could be worse COVID situations in their home countries, or worse healthcare situations. They're going to be a lot more affected than maybe you will be if you've got family and friends in close proximity. On the other hand, lots of international students actually have a very good network, so maybe one doesn't necessarily need to be as worried about them, but you need to ask the question, okay? We don't want people getting out here feeling very, very upset. I'm not seeing any statistics about fatal effects of isolation, increased suicide rates, but there's a lot written about mental health issues. And of course, if people are not able to do things in the way that you normally do, they're not going to be feeling super. On the other hand, lots of people actually were working in this way. So on the personal thing, let's think about what you can do. And the first point here, I think, is quite important. That you should set a good example. If your university has specific regulations about whether you should be in a work, whether you shouldn't be in a work, whether you should be wearing a face mask or not, or however you should be doing it, you should be following the rules, okay? Because that's the first thing you can do. And you shouldn't be then forcing your students to come into the workplace if your local authorities are saying don't do that, and vice versa. So make sure that you're actually being a good leader. We heard Eilish mention that, and being a good leader is important. Be emotionally supportive, and of course you need to ask how your students are feeling. It's very difficult when you're talking to a computer screen and ask the question, are you doing okay? It's very easy for someone saying sure, but are they? And this is where your ability to read their body language might come in. But you also need to think about yourself, because everyone talks about the ill health of students, but no one talks about the ill health of faculty. Everyone's feeling like crap. The administrators, the heads of the departments, the directors, like everyone is affected by this, by having to have their whole work place upside down. So, don't disregard the fact that maybe you're not thinking this is thrilling either. For PIs who are worried about grant possibilities, about not necessarily producing the work they need to ensure the next thing, the publication processes are taking longer. There's a lot more extra stress for us as well. So don't neglect that. Think about yourself as well. Civility I've mentioned, which I think is a really, really wonderful thing. I read a report just recently, and that now people are starting to go back to work. That we have new issues because people actually have lost the social ability to interact in a nice way. At least the people who are working in service industries, whether they be people working the flight personnel or people in shops, are saying people are downright nasty. They're not as nice as they were anymore. So we need to learn. And when you're actually having a face-to-face meeting with the people, it's a lot different from how you do it when you're doing it in Zoom. So we need to relearn how to be sort of nice colleagues to each other as well, which I think is something I would never have thought one would have had to do. It's like going back to school again. Be a strong leader. This isn't the time to be wishy-washy. This is the time to be completely definitive. If the stronger you can be, and when I say strong, I'm not meaning muscles, I'm meaning being definite, being direct, being supportive, right? That's what being a strong leader is about. And this is the time to be a strong leader as opposed to a weak leader. That's not taking a responsibility, showing your responsibility, showing your interest, showing that you're good at your job. Flexibility, of course, you have to be, because people will be having bad days, and they might not necessarily be having bad days at the time that you want them to have bad days, and so on. And you will be potentially losing time in your research projects. That's one of the expectations that won't necessarily be fulfilled. There might be time lost, but there's nothing you can do about it. So flexibility you need to have, but not by giving people a get out of jail card to let them be lazy. identify individual needs. Maybe you have several students or you have postdocs as well to take care of. Maybe they come from different parts of the world. Not everyone will be wanting to be dealt with in the same way. So you need to really, really work on that repertoire. How will I push the right buttons for this person in order to get the best out of them? What does this student need when it comes to supervision compared to this student? So the sort of the most important thing is this: more intense structure and focused supervision. This isn't the time to be like less hands-on. This is the time to be more hands-on. On my hands-on, I'm just meaning interacting. Time for supervision is the thing that all students complain about, that we don't give them enough time. Now you need to give them even more time, okay, not less. And then there are sort of certain things that you need to try and ensure, both for yourself, but also to ask these questions about your students. Do they have regular breaks from what they're doing? Are they making sure that they're eating and sleeping more healthily? There have been lots of people then getting into bad health habits, and that will impact potentially on the way that you do your work. Make time for creativity, recharging. You know, it's not like just because you're stuck at home, it doesn't mean you need to be stuck at home the whole time. If you're in a workplace, or from what I miss is walking from place to place for all the meetings that I have one after another. Isn't it crazy at Zoom that you just stop one meeting and you start the next one 1 second later? You know, and sometimes I sit in meetings which are booked in from 8 in the morning until 6 in the night, and I don't even have time to go to the toilet. How crazy is that? Well, and that time that you have that used to be walking around, going up the stairs, was good for your mental health and good for your physical health as well. So can you put breaks into what you do? Can you take a walk around the housing area where you are? Do something at least, or do something that makes it fun, that breaks up your day, recharges the batteries. I think that's an important issue to think about that many of us neglect. International cultures, I've already mentioned that. Not everyone will be being the same, and this is also something that we often neglect. Ask for feedback about how it's going. Get your students to tell you whether you think that it's actually working with this remote supervision or not, because that's the only way you're going to be able to modify what you're doing in order to make it better. How often have you done that? You'll be asking your student lots of questions, but how often have you asked them questions about you in your role? So I think that would be really, really important. And it might be that you get different answers from different people. That's telling you then that what the individual needs of those individuals are. One thing I forgot to mention about the Zoom culture, which is quite interesting, is that I read another recent report that 80% of the people who are in Zoom meetings are actually doing something else. That means that there's only about 21 of you who's actually listening to what I'm saying, and everyone else is actually doing something with the right hand there. There's also another reason why you should always use the gallery form, because then you can clearly see if people, especially people with glasses, because you can see the computer screens flickering when they're doing something. But that's a little aspect which I think is quite fun as well. Although it's quite tragic, because it means that even if you're having all these online meetings with your student, it might be that they're not as efficient as you think you are. You ask Eilish and Ben their best tips for being a supervisor, and I come down to this one, pictured here. Happy people will work and perform. Unhappy people won't, because they're spending time being unhappy. So I think that the more you can make people happy and inspired at what they're doing, then they'll sweat blood for you. And that certainly worked well for me with my students, which I'm still supervising today. And last but not least, we need to make sure we're still actually, things are ticking along. You know, your students still need to they have a finite time before their thesis defense. So how are you going to make sure that they get to where they should be? How do you make sure that they're actually working in the way that you think they're working? You know, you provide them with the possibilities and equipment, but how do you know that's being done the right way? And at the end of the day, it's all about actually producing science, whether you publish it in papers or not, or the thesis, but you know that that's what needs to be delivered. So how are you going to make sure that things are ticking along? We've already talked about the fact that you need to follow. You can be sharing data and giving feedback, and there can be online teaching courses that your students are attending, and you can have discussions about them. So those are all the things we've already talked about. But what else should one think about? Involving all the supervisors. Maybe you have more than one supervisor. We do it here in Sweden at least. And like, are you making best use of them all? Is your student then having interaction with all the supervisors, or only you, if at all? make sure that they get as much input as possible. And the more that they're interacting with the others, then the less they necessarily need to interact with you. So it kind of makes sense and kind of smart. Engage in online work activities yourself. Again, this is a part of, like, if we're going to embrace this culture, and I don't think we're ever going to go back to the way we were before. Our organization Orpheus had its first online conference, and it was a great success. We had to, because of COVID, we couldn't travel down to Minho in Portugal, which was a great shame because it's a wonderful place. But this is going to be the way we do it, and there are a lot more people attending conferences. I just read today in a report from the US, 120% extra, people attending online courses, especially among students, because then there's no expense involved, and being able to log in online. So this is a great possibility that we need to embrace. So how much are you doing it yourself? How many seminars have you been attending, other than this one, of course, today? And you can set a good example there and actually embrace that. We now opened up to online teaching. You don't need to be having a teaching course at UCD or Trinity. You can be doing it at Harvard or in Beijing, right? If there's a great course there, because now we have those possibilities and the world is open for those type of interactions. So embrace that and make sure you're being a good role model for your students yourself by actually doing it. Otherwise, you should be doing exactly the same type of activities as you would be doing in the workplace. So are you still having journal clubs or lab meetings, courses, conferences I've already mentioned, or whatever, if you're in the humanities or in the legal world or whatever your subject? Are you doing the same things? Because you should do the same things. If you're supposed to be working from home, you should be having the same type of activities. And I already mentioned this possibility. Use the possibility. This is a fantastic possibility, a new possibility for more extensive interaction, whether it be locally, nationally, or internationally. It also gives us nowadays, it's politically, and not just politically, it's important for us all to think about sustainable development practice. And the data I read this morning, there was an online conference, 7,000 participants. And the carbon copy of those 7,000 participants online is the same as for one person turning up in face-to-face by getting on a plane and traveling. So we have to think about that even if we think it's more fun to be there face-to-face, do we really need to? And does that help towards attaining sustainable development goals? Last but not least, if you don't already do it, you need to be even more sure when you're supervising remotely to set deadlines and follow up that timeline, because time is too easy to lose. And this is relates back to the frequency of your interaction, how much time you're interacting, and then what you're actually setting as tasks, and having these bite-sized tasks, which will give your students the feeling of progression in learning a lot easier. But this is your way of following up. So make sure that you're doing that. So my take-home messages, I've already stressed this the most. You need to be feeling good that this is working for you and your students. And that might be very much down to your individuals. You need to make sure that you are functional, that this is an efficient way of working. And if it's not, how are you going to find out? You know yourself if you think it's working, but you need to ask your students if it's working for them, and you need to see whether there's some productivity or not. You need to think more, not less. Out of sight, out of mind, no. Out of sight, more in mind is what we need to say instead. It is the same job. You have the same responsibilities. There should be the same expectations. It's just we're doing it in a different way. And you need to then learn how to do it and embrace that. Take this opportunity to work out how to communicate digitally in the most efficient way. And maybe there's new ways of doing it you never even thought about. We have a young generation of youngsters that are used to like everything being short communication via digital apparatuses. So embrace that. And this could be a way of actually making your work practices even more efficient in the possibility. This is an opportunity for you to learn something about yourself. I've certainly learned a lot about teaching online, which I do all over the world. And it's kind of fun, but it's really difficult. And you have to put even more inspiration into what you're doing. Otherwise, it's so boring, and you understand why 80% of the people are not listening to you and answering their emails instead. So it's been a great way to actually increase your pedagogical skills. And as I've said, at the very least, knowing how to use the digital platform, Zoom or otherwise, is important thing. And the last point here is really, really important. I believe in empowering leadership and letting people own their responsibilities. So rather than, you know, a weekly check-in with your students and giving them a list, like a shopping list of things that need to be done by Friday, that's not the way to inspire them, but to actually give them the possibility to take their professional responsibility of getting the work done, of asking you for the help that you need. That's the way that you inspire people to develop. And I think that should be something that you need, and the way you can inspire your other colleagues, your other supervisors through those interactions. Last but not least, I go back to where I started, that everyone talks about COVID and the pandemic is gloom and doom and darkness. Here you have a picture of Van Gogh, who's my favorite artist, and it's to make the point that, you know, if we didn't have darkness, then you wouldn't be able to see stars shining. So think about how brightly you shine as a supervisor star in this darkness. All right, that's all I wanted to say. And now I think we have some time for some discussion or some trading experiences. So we'll leave the floor open.
Janet, will I hand over to you to kind of moderate the discussion?
Sure, absolutely. Well, thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
You've encapsulated a lot of common sense through a supervision lens, which is really, really useful for everybody. So thank you very much. I have a question, and I know you've touched on it a little bit, but just would you have any specific tips about how to keep students motivated who are working remotely?
If they're not already motivated to do their projects, you recruited the wrong people. No.
Well, let's say everybody's there and they're signed.
No, I think that, you know, usually at the workplace, I have the general rule that people like to be seen and heard, right? So I taught my old professor to do that, to just take a walk down the corridor and say hello to people, to show an interest. And you can do the same then digitally. It's a lot more difficult if you're not having a phone people, because then you'll interrupt them. This is where the drop-in sort of open Zoom can work a little bit. But as long as you're interacting with them, then you have the chance to if they're feeling that you're taking care of them, then they should be motivated. The other thing is to just reiterate, you know, the goals of what you're trying to do, what you're trying to achieve. You can never say that too often. I think we often just we might, you know, I love to use this word assume. If you break it up into ASS, you and me, you get making an ass of you and me, and you should never assume anything, but you should just be, you know, making sure that the people are understanding what they're doing and why. Research doesn't stop just because there's a pandemic. It means that you need to find creative ways to do something that otherwise that you can still do remotely, or you can still do your supervision remotely, which otherwise you'd be doing face to face. So I think that you need to, my best tip would be to actually ask yourself, how do I maintain my own motivation in my role? And if you can find whatever works for you, then test that with your students. But it's if you're not having contact, then you're not going to be inspiring, and they're not going to be motivated. So more contact, not less.
Great, thank you. Have we any questions for Bob from the group? Everyone's gone very shy, or else your message was crystal clear. Emer, would you like to pop in there?
Yes, hello everybody. Sorry about the darkness. It's all to do with lighting where I am. I'm from DCU. Thank you, Bob, for your presentation. I have a very specific question. How do you, the whole psychosocial aspect is very important, and the emotional aspect. And it's one thing when you're meeting them face to face or going to lunch together, but when you're meeting them online, and you know, it's very easy to cover up, and other than saying how are you and how are you coping or whatever, have you any other tips in because we can't read the body language other than the head and shoulders in that lighting?
The one thing I didn't mention is how you can actually interact socially. I know I don't do it myself. With all my students are actually still working. I've been working the whole time anyway, so I still go to the workplace to meet them. But I know that other people have been organizing social interactions. You know, I mean, people have been having dinner parties via Zoom, where you can do quizzes or something to make sure people are interacting in that way. But it really depends on, you need to know your individuals, and you need to know yourself. Some people are just not so good at this and not so social. So if you're not so social yourself, it's not going to work via Zoom, right? So don't try pushing something that's not going to be good. That's the one thing I would say. But you need to experiment, and you can ask people whether they're doing something. You know, I start my lab meetings on a Monday morning by asking people what they've done during the weekend. You know, and at the very least, are they telling me lies? I have no idea. You know, but anything you can do to try and make sure that they're still living life and are not sitting there being upset that they not seeing anyone. If you have international students, and ask them how it's going with their families, and then they'll be able to get them to talk is the most important thing. And you can do that in different ways. And some people won't want to do it in groups, and some people will. But I think you just need to test that. And it's very, very difficult. And no one's really going to ask you how you're doing, and not your students, at least, in the same way. But if you're not feeling very good, if you're having some difficulties with your children or whatever, you know, then tell them about it. And the more that you tell your stories to them, the more they'll probably tell their stories to you.
Yeah.
So
we have a question. Oh, sorry.
It wasn't such a good answer, but that's all I can think about at the moment. But do it, just experiment, you know.
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat from Fidelna. What about the impact of peer influence? Students need it, and on the other hand, may also be unduly affected by it. Have you any advice on this aspect of virtual supervision?
I mean, the students interacting with each other is nothing that you can control. You can encourage it, and especially if you have students within your lab or within your group, then you should encourage their interaction, because they will be feeling more of a loss of each other than they probably are of the loss of you, because they're working more closely with each other. So you should think about the colleagues might want to have a forum and a get together that you're not involved in. It's an interesting aspect, but a lot of I have a Chinese student, and we have a lot of Chinese students at Karolinska, and they have a fantastic network. So they have an unbelievably active through WeChat network with the activities going on and constant interaction with each other. I'm not at all worried for that person, how they're interacting, either scientifically or socially. But I think this is how much do you know about your students? How much do you know about them as individuals? What do you really think? How do you perceive what they think they need? And then you can ask questions about whether you think that's being fulfilled or not. I think it's important that the lab members, if you have people who are used to working together, that you give them a possibility, you encourage them to talk to each other. Absolutely.
That was another question I was going to ask you about, how you encourage, if a student flags with you that they feel isolated, how can you, as a supervisor, support that? Yeah,
I think the only practical way you can do it is to spend more time with them, like online. If we're talking about an online interaction, that's the only thing you can do. I'm just waiting for the time where someone's going to be so affected by this that they're going to be a fatal outcome. Hasn't happened yet, but it is depressing, and depending on the support systems, and we don't know too much necessarily. Some people don't like to talk about their personal situation, so how would you know? But we need to. It's a terrible thing to think, you know, that someone will do something drastic, and you never ask the question. So in that respect, you need to try and, if you don't know so much about your staff, this is a good way to start to get to know them and to try and work it out. It's impossible. We often say it's like at the title you gave me was successful. You can't be sure. Or how can you ensure? You can never ensure. All you can do is try. And then
I think the most important thing you highlighted as well was actually ask for feedback.
Absolutely.
I mean, is your approach working? Why we shouldn't be afraid of asking students this.
Feedback, that's a whole different lecture which I give, but feedback is a gift, and we need to get that into our thick heads, right? That professional feedback should be the norm, right? And not only negative, but positive feedback as well. And the more we get used to doing that, then the better it will be. And we don't do that in our business. And so at the very least, you know, I mean, the two supervisors that got the awards today, you know, I'm sure that they're asking the students about how they're doing, and that's why they're able to become excellent supervisors. That's the way you learn, by asking questions, right? We should encourage that culture.
We have a question from Lena. A really great talk. Thank you. I still remember some of the tips and observations Bob gave us a few years back.
Oh, hope they're working.
Good. So we run postgraduate seminar series in Trinity, line up good talks and have good attendance, but most students have their cameras off and not chat or talk. Is it okay to ask everyone to have the camera on, and how can we encourage participation?
I think it's it's disrespectful to have the cameras off, like half of you are now that I can see. But at the end of the day, like if everyone's got the camera on, now everyone's flashing on that. You're all beautiful, I know that, but it doesn't really make any difference because I can't see everyone at the same time anyway. So is it that important, right? But you know, if you haven't got people who are paying attention, they're not going to pay attention if they've got the camera on or off. Does it really make it? Is it so important? I think the other thing about sort of participation, especially when it's very difficult when you're teaching. If you have a lot of people, you throw out a question, no one says anything, and you're sort of dying on the spot here. But and then you tend to not ask. It's very difficult to get the interactivity. But if you have a small group of people, then you can actually ask them specifically by name, because you only got a few people. And so you have enough people where everyone can be seen in the same gallery view. Then it's very easy to get interactivity by asking specific questions for people and not letting the people who like talking, like, you know, rob the time from everyone else. So one needs to think about that to encourage participation, but in the right way. How do we encourage participation if people are feeling attacked or feeling put down or put on the spot? It also depends on their personalities, what they really like. If you have a face-to-face meeting, not everyone talks either. So like it's the same thing. However you try and get people interacting in a group face-to-face, you need to try the same thing online.
Great, thanks, Bob. Eileen Ryan, you have a question for Bob?
Yeah, sorry. I promise I was paying attention. My camera wasn't on. Yeah, I guess it's to know your student. We've got, I suppose we have to have an emotional intelligence, and this is where it comes into it. And some people may have that naturally and other people don't.
Absolutely.
Do you think you learn as you go as well?
It's the same in anything in life. If you want to, you can.
Yeah.
Right. But if you don't want to, then you won't. I'm 55 years old. I still don't have a driver's license. It's telling me now, I haven't thought about it for the last 30 years, that I don't really want to. You know, otherwise I would have done it. Right. And it's much the same. Do you need to? Now, I always think personally, I'm a very good person. I'm a person's person. So I feel that I know my staff well enough that I can just look at them and I know if they're having a good day or a bad day. I know who I should spend more time with or who I don't need to spend time with on that day, if that would be. And you don't do that by guessing. You only do that by interacting. I get fantastic help from my economic administrator, and I'm hopeless at anything economical. So my research group is always on a wing and a prayer. And I spend so long listening to her talk about her kids and all sorts of things. It's an older lady. She's lovely. But the day I need her, because I really screwed up, she'll walk over fire for me to help me, because I've got that interaction. So I think the more that you get to know one another, and especially the more they get to understand you and your role in the faculty, you're more than a supervisor, you do other things as well, then the more understanding they'll have, and the more keeping it completely professional. We're not talking necessarily, there's not a necessity to go out for drinks or dinner or whatever, but you know, if you don't get to know someone, then you're not going to be able to know how to make them happy, and making them happy is the trick, because the happier they are working for you, the more they're going to work. So, but it's if you're not that type of person, then don't worry about it, because they're doing okay anyway. So I think one shouldn't stress, but it's always good if you're not necessarily good at it. Why not learn?
Yeah. Thank you.
I should sign up for driving school tomorrow.
Bob, we have a question from Alan Sloan in the chat. How do you feel about recording one-on-one Zoom supervisory meetings, and would you make those available to the student or to anybody else?
To anybody else, there's no necessity for that. If you're having a meeting with someone, then that's just between the two of you. I think as long as you're in agreement for doing it, it's a great way of recording, you know, what's said and done. I think that it depends on the issues. If you're having Yeah, it's always good. It's a great way to record things. If you've got a memory like mine, it would be perfect. I wish I recorded all my meetings that way, because then I know what I agreed to do. But the downside is that people might then not be honest in what they're saying. They might be guarded in what they're saying. You might not get the information that you really want to. So it depends on the situation. But as a record of, you know, why not? The other thing you can do is quite easily during a meeting is actually use the note dictation model on your phone, so that whilst you're having the conversation, instead of actually getting the video, you're getting a transcript in text, which is very easy then just to send as an email. And it's slightly less some people are worried about being seen, you know. Not all of us are beautiful, and certainly not myself. So it's like some people will be a lot more conscious about that, or maybe you're sitting in a dark room, or you know, and so is it necessary to actually tape the video? No. But is it important to have a record of what was said? Yes. So I think the dictation function on the phone is probably the best way of doing it. But it's, as long as you're in agreement, then anything will go.
Speaking of agreement, Maria Lotti has a question. Would you recommend any online supervision issues be outlined in a supervision contract or agreement?
I think that we're not sure how long we're going to have to do this. As I said, that maybe even post-pandemic, this would be a great way to interact for some people, or in some ways. I mean, if you work efficiently at home, not that I can, then this is maybe a great way to work. And so online supervision, or at least for 1 or 2 days a week, might be the norm. And in which case, then you need to be completely honest about it right from the start. I think that it's important to set the rules and regulations for how you do things, at least when you're interacting in this way. And if you then need to write it down, the more that you write down and agree on, the better, you know, then absolutely. It's whatever, again, there's a lot of whatever works for you, however you think will best suit you and your students, then that's the best for you.
A question from Stephen McCarthy for you, Bob. Would you have any recommendations for balancing student well-being while also driving them towards the best result possible in their PhD? It can be a difficult balancing act.
This very much depends on the nature of the work that you're doing. If you have ambitious students that really want to achieve something, then they'll go for it at any rate, and often they'll work too much the same as many of us do as well, because we think we're superhuman. At the end of the day, if someone gets sick, then they're not going to be working, and they're not good, right? So there's a limit. I think that it's up to the individuals. I think one just needs to have a discussion about it. As I said, I mentioned earlier, I always ask my students, what are you doing? A few years ago, I asked them on a Monday morning, how was your weekend? And one of my new students said, what do you mean? I was in working. And I was like, what? Get a life. You should be out drinking beers and you know, having fun. And he said, well, the whole lab was in. Everyone was working. And if you create a workplace that everyone is enjoying being together, then they'll work and they'll be ambitious and that they enjoy their working. So when we talk about the work-life balance, it's not necessarily the hours, it's what you're doing. If you're being efficient, then you can work very few hours, or for some people, you need to work lots of hours in order to come up to the same efficiency. So it's very much a question of, you know, what's necessary and how it's going for you. What you don't want is for people not to be feeling good, because then they're either working too much or they're not working efficiently. It's not necessarily working too much. If you put in a lot of hours but don't achieve too much, you're not working in an efficient way. That's your issue. Okay, and then you have another conversation to have. So there's no like one rule here. I think as long as you're asking questions, then your students will feel that you care about them. And it's being a caring person, even if it's just lip service, is enough to actually keep them going. And not asking those questions and not having any interest is probably not the best way to achieve it. So I think that would be my answer to that one.
I just want to thank David. He says, no disrespect to having the camera off when you're looking after 2 small infants at the same time.
Absolutely not. I mean,
thanks, David, for that one.
No, but in actual fact, that's a really important issue. It's like we all laugh about, you know, when you're having a Zoom and the dog comes in, or a cat jumps on your head, or a baby screaming, or your young daughter sits on your lap. But it's not professional. So it's much more professional actually to have the camera off and to be muted and actually not have those distractions. So I completely agree with you.
Absolutely. A question from O. Lennon. Relationship building is key and this takes time. How many students can you supervise at one time if you're doing this correctly? or does having students phased at different PhD stages work better?
Yeah, it's the question I always get all over the world, and it's one that's impossible to answer because it really depends on the nature of your work and what other activities that you have or responsibilities. I think for many of us, we're not full-time researchers, and if you're not 100% researcher, then it means you're not 100% available. My recommendation, at least here at the Karolinska, is don't be main supervisor for more than 3, and hopefully stagger them so they're not all like going through exactly the same time. I think you can be co-supervisor to as many as you like, because someone else then has got the main responsibility. But more than 3, if you're really going to give them the time each week to have a good interaction one-on-one as well as in a group, and also do everything else that you're supposed to be able to do, then I can't see someone managing it. If you're 100% researcher, doing no teaching, doing no administration, you have a good hierarchy, you have lots of people otherwise that can help with the supervision, maybe on paper you can actually take in more. But on the other hand, if you're in that situation, why don't you give someone else the responsibility of being the main supervisor and you be the co-supervisor? Is it really important that you're the main supervisor? So I think that's more the question, but you can't have too many. If you think that this box is the amount of time you have and each student is taking this much space, right? Then you fill up the space and you've only got this much space left to do everything else. Like how many, you can't fit like 100 hands into this box. So you need to be smart about your time, and you need to be honest about your time, and you need to understand in what capacity do you need to be supervising. So I think that that's my answer there. Not too many, not too few.
Finbar, you have a question for Bob?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. It's really useful. And I guess my question's around, I guess, the negative side of virtual online supervision of a PhD student in Ethiopia. Yeah. And you can imagine the situation over there currently, but the internet is shocking. It's government controlled. It literally shuts down every time we try and have a meeting. So it's almost impossible to supervise remotely at the moment. And I wonder, have you any tips or how to deal with that?
Yeah, I forgot to mention that right at the start, and that was part of the infrastructure thing. You know, the assumption is that everyone will have a good functioning internet, and if you don't, then it's really difficult, and particularly for those reasons. Then I think you need to interacting in a different way. And if you can't have Zoom meetings where you need to see each other, then you need to communicate by email or through Google Docs or something, and find a different way to make it less frustrating, because it's terrible when people are freezing or they're disappearing and you just don't get any flow. So it's not good at all. Or you need to try and find a time of the day, even if it's like a bad time of day for you, but it might be a good time of day for them. For example, in the middle of the night, where things might work a little bit better once in a while, just in order to have that conversation, to have a check-in. But I think that being that remote is extremely difficult. I was giving a talk in China a month or so ago, and there were people from all over the world presenting, and the first 3 people had bad connections or didn't get the technology. One person that muted themselves and they spoke for 10 minutes, not that we could hear anything, and it was a joke, you know. And 1 hour of the program went past, and no one has succeeded in their presentations. So one should also think about the complexity of what one's trying to do. But absolutely, in your case, you need to find a way then of having a communication that's not necessarily perfect. It's good to have a talk like we're doing now, but if you can't do that, just find another way of communicating that works.
There's a tip in the chat for you, Finbar, from Eilish. She says WhatsApp works better than Zoom in Africa.
Absolutely, yeah.
Great, yeah, thank you.
I have a question. If there's no other question, we did Finbar. Is there any other questions for Bob? No, not at the moment. And it's really, as a supervisor, are the positives that you have experienced or found over your practice over the pandemic that you will take?
It's been wonderful. I actually, you know, I only get 20% of my time to be a researcher. On paper, I get 20% of my time. In reality, I get like 2%. So I've actually had more interaction with my students during the pandemic than ever, because we have good online interaction. So it's been actually a plus for me. And they're very happy. I turned up at a lab meeting the other day, and they almost, like a big lab meeting that we have, not just for my group, and they almost were shocked to see me. I got presented as a special guest, you know, but it was like, so it's actually been beneficial for me in that way. I've had a lot more interaction because I can have short interactions, and we exchanged a lot of messages on the phone as well, and it's been a lot more dynamic. So do
you hope to bring that forward?
I think it's shown them that because I'm sitting in a different building from them, this is why I don't have the interaction. When I'm doing all my other things, I'm in a different building. I'm not where my research lab is, and that's why I'm not around for them to be able to just pop in. But now they've actually seen that, it gets so used to just writing me a message and be able to do that. Then it's something we'll continue with, absolutely. So I think that this is also what I tried to say earlier. See the opportunities, not just the challenges. It's not all negative, and one needs to be creative. And it might be that you find better ways to work, just as I have myself.
Yeah, better ways to work, smart work.
Smart work, yeah.
On that note, Bob, I don't think we've any more questions. I'd like to thank you so much from everybody who's here today. I really enjoyed the presentation, and it was enormously helpful. Like I said, encapsulating some really good tips there for research supervisors.
Yeah, and anyone gets any questions or thoughts afterwards, just
absolutely, you could shoot them through me, and if anybody would like a copy of the presentation, I have a PDF version of it. So just in relation to the next webinar, I think we're kicking off again in January. Joanna, if you wouldn't mind sticking the link there, the Eventbrite link, into the chat. Anybody who'd like to look at the program of activities, it will be there, or you can contact us directly, or the relevant graduate studies representative in your university who's working as part of the collaboration. So on that note, thank you so much, Bob.
It's all my pleasure.
Really appreciate it.
Next time.
Yes, promise face-to-face next time. We'll go for a Guinness.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, and thanks everybody for taking part today, and wishing you all a lovely Christmas in the meantime till we see you again. Thanks very much.
And may I add my thanks to Bob and Janet and everybody else, and Joanna and Elizabeth in the background for the great as always, Bob. Really enjoyed having you with us today.
Nice to see you again, Barbara.